Hi, class. So, today's lesson, what we want to do is really just a kind of a brief introduction to this topic, which is elements and principles of, well, generally what we call graphic design, but we quite often refer to them also as elements and principles for desktop publishing, because that's one of the kind of terms that's been about for a while. Now, just as a wee kind of precursor, I suppose it's worth touching on the fact that with the current restrictions and not being able to get into school, there is a kind of a limit on what we can do currently because we don't have access to desktop publishing software like Zara that we would usually have in school. So we're going to come back to that because the main point of this unit of work is to prepare you to do the packaging part of your toy, so your real toy project, and the design of the packaging would allow you to apply these elements and principles and your skills in Zara using desktop publishing software. But because we can't go into Zara, what we can do at home is prepare a bit by developing our understanding of the layout elements and principles themselves, which is something we would do in class anyway. It's just that normally we would do one of the elements or principles and then we'd do a wee practical task on Zara based on that element or principle, and then we kind of switch around doing that kind of lesson by lesson. So here, what we're probably going to focus on doing is just learning how to identify and analyze the elements and principles. And then when we come back into school, we'll do some tasks which are just more practical, having hopefully kind of got more of this kind of, I suppose, this theory side of things out of the way. I say out of the way, I don't mean that it is not important, and I don't even think it's particularly boring. I think it's quite interesting if you take an interest in graphic design, if you're open to doing that. So what we're going to do today is outline what these elements and principles are and why they're relevant to the course. And we're going to introduce the ones that we need to know about at National 5, because there's actually quite a lot of them, but we only need to know a relatively small range of them at National 5 level. So just as a kind of background, in any DTP work or desktop publishing work, it's really important to learn how to apply these properly. And when we think about desktop publishing work, that the term graphic design as a kind of an industry or as a job is really kind of what we're talking about. Okay, so graphic designers are the people who work on generally what we think of as promotional graphics, going back to our understanding of the three Ps. Promotion usually tends to kind of come at the tail end of the process when we've developed our product and we're just trying to publicize it, really, and promote it. So that's things like advertisements, packaging, websites, app design, books, all sorts of stuff. Really anything that's, I guess, two dimensional generally and has some sort of a graphic design to it. That's what graphic designers do. Now, you'll hear these principles described in lots of different ways because, like in a lot of things, different people in different kind of aspects of the industry have different ways of talking about them, but we'll refer to them as the elements and principles of design. And so it's worth maybe taking a wee moment to explain the distinction between an element and a principle. So, an element, the way I like to think of it, is they're the actual things on the page, the things that we can make decisions about. So, that would be stuff like lines, colors, shapes, and so on. These are the ingredients. So, kind of like making soup, your ingredients might be the different things that you actually put in the pot. The principles are really more about kind of stepping back from the actual things themselves and thinking about what we do with them. So the principles are the principles that we use to guide us towards arranging those elements. So that's really our layout, how everything appears on the page, how it's positioned, considerations about its size and scale relative to each other, colors, where we align things with each other. Um, so I kind of think about this as more being like the how you'd put the ingredients together as part of a recipe. If you were making some sort of pasta dish, you wouldn't just take all the ingredients and throw them in one pan together at the same time. There'd be a process and there'd be considerations about why you put one thing in at a certain time, how long you cook that, maybe how much seasoning you add. So the principles are kind of the how we deal with the elements side of things. And they're really important actually because they're what really makes the difference between kind of amateurish, clumsy, inconsidered designs and those that look professional. And that for a brand, for a company, from a marketing point of view, is hugely important because it conveys a message about the company itself, about its style, about its ethics, about how it wants to be seen. And it can also target certain demographics. So the graphic style that you choose to put across as a graphic designer will be attractive to some people and maybe less attractive to others. And that's a really important consideration as well. And from a functional point of view, what we're quite often trying to do with promotional graphics is, first of all, get people's attention. And to do that, we need to create interest. So people aren't going to look at something if they don't find it interesting or attractive in any way. And secondly, we need to make sure that when they do actually take an interest in it, and they do look at it, it's clear enough for them to understand, particularly if it's a functional thing like a website or an app where people have to navigate through it and, use utilities within it. We need to make sure it's all clear how it works. And there are ways we can use visual cues to help with that. And that's all part of this idea of the principles, how we actually do things with the elements. So that's what really we're kind of talking about here, and why it's kind of important from a kind of industrial point of view. From a school point of view, the big part of why this is important is that it's all in the course. So at National 5, this is a past paper for National 5. You'll see there are questions about DTP or graphic design layouts, like this one here, which is asking you to describe how the designers used these elements and principles within the layout. And within the assignment at National 5, you'll also find that the promotional parts of the graphics are usually directed to use certain elements and principles. So that's why it's really important for us to learn how to basically use these, how to identify them. So if you're in an exam situation, you can pick out where they've been used, how to analyze them, so we can talk about, not just where they are, but why they might have been used, like what the purpose actually is. And also how we apply them. So that's why we need to then develop skills in Zara, so that when we're using our software, whether it's Zara or whatever it might happen to be that you would use in industry, you know how to take all those elements and physically actually control them, place them, move them, manipulate them to get these effects and apply these principles. So National 5 in GraphicCom, you need to know about these 6. So of those 6, line is actually the only thing that we describe as an element. The rest are all principles. So I'm not going to go into explaining them, because as we move through these lessons, we are going to look at these individually. So the first lesson will be on line, and then we're going to look at alignment and so on, dominance. So I don't want to get too bogged down in explaining what they all are and trying to get you to understand them all right now. We're going to deal with that a bit at a time, because it'd be a lot to take on. But just to look at this example graphic that I've got on the right-hand side here, it's quite a straightforward one, but it's actually quite a good way of illustrating how all of these have actually been considered by the designer in creating it. So first of all, we've got line, and if we look at this layout, obviously a lot of the actual illustrations are line illustrations. They're all based on lines. And that creates a kind of degree of harmony throughout the whole page, because everything's very simple. It's all using the same sort of style. But putting that aside, from just a purely functional point of view, line is actually really important, because in here we've got these lines above and below the text where it says C that help to separate that out. And you'll see that lines again are used to create these kind of scrolls around the date and year. So these lines do quite a few things. They also connect, so even though it's not necessarily just a single line, a kind of a line brush with this kind of rope effect draws us through the whole graphic from the top around these illustrations and then right down to the bottom. So the lines are used in a few places for a couple of different purposes within that layout. When we talk about alignment, if we looked at this layout again, the whole the way that this graphic has been arranged is that it's all centrally aligned, so that the graphics themselves are centrally aligned to each other. So this text, all these different sections of text here, this image, these little banners, they're all centrally aligned with each other, and they're also all centrally aligned with the page itself. We've got dominance being created by largely scale. The dominant thing in this layout is the word C, because it's biggest and it's in the middle of the page. And it also has this kind of shadow, which kind of ties into depth, which we'll talk about in a moment. We have unity created, which is one of the really simple but really important things to consider in graphic design, and that's particularly when you've got a lot going on in a page, how to make it not look too kind of confusing and busy and complicated, because there's a lot going on in this page, but what they've done to create a sense of unity is keep a really consistent color scheme. all the colours, it's just a 2-colour palette with a black background. So although there's lots of different illustrations, we've got stars, bubbles, the rope, these kind of fish, the record player. We've got lots of different types and styles of font. We've got at least 3 or 4 different styles of font, I think, in this layout. So there's a lot of different stuff going on, and that could easily end up looking like a bit of a mess. But by just using a simple colour scheme with 2 colours that work well together, they've created a sense of unity all the same. Beyond that, they've got a sense of depth. So depth is created in this through a couple of mechanisms. One is the adding of like a drop shadow here. So that gives a sense of something having depth. We have this writing here where the scroll kind of overlaps itself if you look here. So we've got a kind of a sense of layering again created with that. We've got these graphics which again are overlaid on top of each other, so they're not all separately spaced out. They all kind of sit at different points. We've got the banner overlapping the record player, these banners with the wee scrolls that give a sense of depth here because the kind of illustration is, 3-dimensional style. So there's quite a lot going on again to give a sense of depth here. Even the fact that as the fish gets further away, it gets smaller. And finally, contrast is being created in a couple of different ways. And contrast is really important as well because it can help to create interest, it can create impact. So looking at this, we have these 2 quite different colours. So we've got green and we've got purple, which are not quite opposite each other on the colour wheel, but they're pretty close to it. And so those colours contrast with each other. That creates impact. The tone, both of these colours have quite a light kind of tonal value, and that contrasts quite a lot with the really dark background to give them more impact. We also have contrasting sizes or scales and fonts. So the actual font styles here are quite different in a few places, from this really fluid kind of cursive script up here through to these lightly serifed fonts and this kind of decorative font. We've got some, quite a lot of difference going on there. And so that all kind of creates a bit more impact and attention. So just looking at one relatively straightforward graphic, if we actually analyse it, we can pick it apart and we can see how all of these different elements and principles actually can be applied and what effect they might have, and we can discuss that. And so we'll learn about these hopefully when we're doing our own design, rather than making just kind of arbitrary random choices. We actually will start to think a little bit more about why we're doing things the way we're doing and making kind of conscious decisions about how to arrange things and place them and choose colour schemes and fonts and all that sort of stuff. So that's just a kind of a summary of, what it is and why it's important, and a kind of just an introduction to the elements and principles. As I say, we'll look at the different elements and principles individually as we go through these lessons, and as part of that process you'll have some opportunities to analyse some graphics yourself to practice that. But for now I've just given you a really simple task, because one of the things that I think is really important in learning about anything is just taking a slightly broader interest and getting a better understanding of what its place is in the world. So if we have a look at this task here, which has been put up, very simple. It's just asking you to try and find a new favourite graphic designer. Now, I get that you might not be terribly interested in graphic design, that's totally fine, but what I would like you to do is just take 15 minutes or so to look through some different graphic designers' work and just choose one that you think is good. It doesn't have to be amazing to you, but as long as you make a conscious decision that that's the one that you like out of the ones you've looked at, that's fine. And then I'd like you to leave just a brief sentence explaining why you've chosen that designer. It could be that you like aspects of their style. It could be that the type of work they do, like the industries that they work in. Maybe they work a lot in games design or doing covers for literature or band posters. That's something you're quite interested in. It could be about their colours, the way they use them. I really don't mind. It could be that they're quite funny. There's a bit of humour in their work. And then I'd like you to insert 2 examples of their work. So from whatever you're looking at, whether it's an article about them or their website, I'd like you to just copy and paste 2 examples of their work that you thought were interesting below. So I would expect you're probably going to take about 10 minutes or so looking for someone, a couple of minutes, to look at each different designer, maybe look at, 5 or 6, and then make a decision, pop it in here, and hopefully that shouldn't take too long. To speed the process up, I've given you 2 links here which will take you to some search results that might help you. If you just search graphic designers in Google, it very helpfully gives you this big bar at the top here with loads of different ones. You can kind of scroll along. There's really no shortage of them. So you could just grab one and see which ones you think are interesting. I personally find Massimo Vignelli's work quite interesting. And who else? I can't actually see her here, but there are a couple of others that I think are pretty good. But yeah, just decide what you think's interesting. So have a look at them. Alternatively, this link here also gives you links to some of these other sites like Creative Block that have lists of graphic designers and talk a little bit about their style. So you could look at one of these links instead of just using that. Really up to you. It's your call how you want to do it. And hopefully that's pretty straightforward how you complete this. Should only take a few minutes. When you finished it, just turn it in. That's about all I really need to say. If you've got any questions, do obviously just leave a comment. Best of luck with the task.